Hey guys, Father Patrick here. Welcome to Godsplaining. We're having a little bit of fun tonight. We're waiting to see whether or not Father Bonaventure is able to join us. So I just thought I'd check on in right here, get things going, and yeah, we can kind of begin our conversation. So if you're just joining, like I said, Father Bonaventure is working on joining the live stream. I'm sitting here texting him, and we'll see what's up. So it might be a it might be a little exciting here as we wait for him. Um, this week is spring break, so a lot of friars are traveling from the House of Studies. I'm out here in Indiana, in Huntington, where our Sunday visitor is headquartered for some meetings out here. Last week, I was at ICYC, the Idaho Catholic Youth Conference. Is amazing. 1,600 teens hanging out for the weekend. I got to give two talks on the main stage there. It was great. That first talk was on sacramentality, so I used the Barbie movie as an example of how to begin to think about reality, the differences between the real world, the world of ideas, and obviously the sacraments are located in the real world and they extend beyond what we know now into eternity. So that was a fun talk. And then the second talk was on the real presence using St. Thomas Aquinas to dive in. So I had a great weekend out there at ICYC with those teens in Idaho. And right now, I would say like everybody else, just looking forward to Easter. Um, so we're getting ready full speed ahead of the House of Studies. Our Easter candle has been delivered, and the brothers are beginning their preparations. This upcoming weekend, we'll have the diaconate ordinations, and our brothers who have just made their solemn profession, who are pursuing holy orders, are going to be advanced to the diaconate. So that'll be a blast. They'll be ordained in the crypt church there in the basilica. Just across the street from the House of Studies in Washington. So that's kind of our lead up. We're already beginning Holy Week preparation, but this weekend we've got this beautiful ordinations. We have a lot of guests coming through the House of Studies, and momentum is just going to continue through graduation and priesthood ordination all the way at the end of this spring here. Let's check in. We're just waiting, friends. If you're just joining, I was saying that Father Bonaventure is just waiting. We're just waiting on him. He's working on joining us for our conversation tonight. So we got just a little bit of a tech difficulty from wherever he's joining us from. I jumped over here to this live stream. I don't know if you guys know Father Rob Galea out of Australia, but I was talking to Father Rob just now about his new ministry in the metaverse, which is pretty wild. That will be an exciting project once he releases this new Roblox game that they've commissioned to teach people the charisma. So that was probably the most exciting thing I did today. Let's see. Has Father Bonaventure sent me anything? This is fun just waiting. I'm about to start telling Dominican and Jesuit jokes here. We're just gonna get going. Okay, he says he's coming. Something like some network issue here. Well, I'll just start narrating the situation as as I see fit, and then we can jump into some of our questions, and we'll see how far we get. We'll see how well we do. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about IVF because there's been so much in the news about it, and I think it's just worth thinking about because it's recently entered into the discourse. Of course, the technology is growing now, been around for some time in an increasing way, but the conversations around IVF are not like the conversations around abortion. This represents, I think, new political territory for us, which is why we saw so strong of a cultural reaction to that decision handed down by the Alabama Supreme Court. So we've covered this extensively over at our Sunday Visitor, Kate Scanlon, our DC and national legal correspondent. She did an amazing job following this. So it was really Kate's coverage that led me to a clear understanding, and then we wrote some great explainers. But I think it's still worth talking about. Okay, and again, that first reason that I think it's worth talking about is because IVF is just coming into the national conversation in a heightened way, a new way in our politics. So again, presuming that everyone has followed this to some extent, a February 16th ruling was handed down by by the Alabama Supreme Court that was brought by couples whose embryos were destroyed in 2020. The 8-1 opinion by the court said that the state's highest court had previously held that unborn children are children for purposes of Alabama's Wrongful Death of a Minor Act. So this is a statute, therefore, that allows parents of a deceased child to recover punitive damages for the child's death. So those embryos, which were destroyed by fertility clinics, were determined to be children by the Alabama Supreme Court, and those fertility clinics, therefore, under the state's law, were considered liable for the destruction of those embryos. This brought on, of course, this tidal wave of national conversation. And where is the situation now after this question has been raised? Well, both the House and Senate in the state of Alabama passed bills to implement legal protections to in vitro fertilization clinics following that Supreme Court ruling. So again, the ruling decided that fertility clinics could be liable and that parents could sue for damages under the wrongful death of a minor, meaning that embryos were understood as children, and that if the embryos were destroyed by the fertility clinics, parents could sue. These protections are intended to promote access to fertility clinics. Um, Now, so this is just the kind of quick lay of the land from the situation in Alabama. And a lot of this conversation has finally come onto our national or into our national discourse about whether or not embryos are actually children. Of course, in the teaching of the Catholic Church, life begins at the moment of conception. Therefore, the embryos, even frozen embryos, have always been understood by the church as children and are therefore to be regarded and treated as such and have all the rights and dignities of every human person under law. Uh, the reason this becomes so thorny um, is, I think, threefold. So, first, because we know we need more kids, and we've heard a number of our politicians talking about this. We're concerned about our population in the United States. We need increased fertility as couples are struggling with fertility. We want to respond to their desires to have children. I think that's really the second one. So we have first a kind of need for our society to have more children. The second is to meet the kind of personal longing for a child that parents have. And the third, I think, is the most difficult to encounter. Is that we have all of us in our lives, people who are conceived through in vitro fertilization, and no one wants to approach that conversation in a way that is insensitive to those people who were conceived through IVF. So these are three kind of factors, and I'll take them each in turn as we move through this. So first, people will promote IVF as a means to continue to sustain our population growth. Well, the reason we should not pay too much attention to this argument is because IVF is so expensive and the losses are so staggeringly great. This is not the way to promote population growth in the United States. So I think we need to be attentive to that and responsive to that. That what couples invest in terms of their personal finances, um, in terms of the loss of human life. This is why IVF is wrong in the eyes of the church, because so many embryos, which are considered persons, are destroyed in the course of IVF. Um, Another reason that IVF is considered wrong is the separation of the generation of life from the sexual act. But we could kind of get to that if it comes up in our conversation. But I just want to talk about and have us think about this argument that we're hearing in the public discourse that we should protect IVF and fertility clinics and promote it because we need to see our population continue to grow. Okay, as regards the second is the reality of the difficulty of infertility. One thing that is incredible in the church is the number of ministries that are reaching out to men and women who are struggling with their fertility. This is one of the best things that we're seeing in the life of the church today. All of these new ministries. Over at our Sunday Visitor, my colleague Katie Yoder, a fantastic journalist over at OSV, wrote a beautiful piece about 10 things that every woman needs to know who's struggling with her fertility. A very, very beautiful, very compassionate piece. I think that piece kind of leads the way in setting the tone and how to talk about this in ways that might be uncomfortable or foreign to a lot of people. So we shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't be afraid of that. All of this is just to say these new ministries, models like Katie and her journalism. All of these are lights that point the way on how to respond to people struggling with fertility without having recourse to means of generating children that are not approved in the church's moral teaching. So there's a lot more that can be done than simply saying, "Well, I'm sorry, you're out of luck." There are actually very many, very beautiful resources that are on offer. The third thing to say is that when we encounter people who are defending IVF because they were themselves conceived by IVF, uh, uh, requires a certain amount of compassion and grace on our part. It's a lot like meeting someone, however, who was conceived by other difficult means. We can think of plenty of instances where the situation of conception is not ideal. None of that reflects on the child, his or herself, right? The boys and girls that are born from these complicated situations. Um, are not themselves to be despised. Their dignity is not harmed by any of this. So we're not attacking persons, and I think that's really the point that I'm wanting to articulate here. We're not attacking persons when we're talking about why the church doesn't support IVF. And this happens all the time when we talk about the church's teaching on human sexuality. Anyone that feels as if they are themselves implicated in the moral teaching of the church can sometimes provoke an emotional or an emotive response that makes it difficult to have that conversation. That does not mean that the truth has changed, though, or that we ourselves should be standoffish in defending it. We have to be compassionate, and we have to be clear. And I think that's really the key. Uh, that by by not being clear, by being unclear, we're not doing anyone any favors. So that's my little introduction to our current recourse here, and we'll see if people drop any questions in the chat. I've still got nothing from Father Bonaventure here, so full speed ahead with Father Patrick explaining, I guess, tonight. Just shooting him another text to see what's up. Well, we'll jump in with a few questions from our Patreon supporters. Thanks for being so generous to us. Victoria writes into us. I once heard Father Bonaventure say in a previous episode that he doesn't think men and women's souls are the same. I hope I'm remembering correctly, something about nature and substance. If we are made in the image and likeness of God, do you think that men and women are only partly made, reflecting only some of God's qualities? I would love him I would love to hear him talk more about his theory and how he came up with it. Well, great. Well, Father Bonaventure is not here, so you get to hear me reflecting on what I would think Father Bonaventure would reflect on in response to this question, Victoria. And we'll do our best to get a direct answer out of him to you, because you were so kind to ask this question of him. But I do want to say if I do want to say a few things in response to it. First of all, men and women are completely made in the image of God. It's not as if men are sort of half God and women are sort of half God. No, so we're true images. And I think that one thing that is perfectly reasonable to articulate in the theological tradition is how men and women differently exemplify some of God's attributes. So there are theologians who, and you may perfectly well disagree with this, but there are theologians who talk about God's more compassionate attributes, God's merciful attributes, as belonging more to women, and God's qualities like his strength or his perseverance as belonging to men. And I don't think this is unreasonable. This seems to match a lot of my life experience. And I think that we can talk about how um, different aspects of uh, God's attributes, different degrees of God's attributes are shown differently in men and women. That part I would be comfortable with. But any kind of, I would be extremely loath, right? The error that I'm trying to avoid here is to say that somehow women are more perfectly the image of God or men are more perfectly the image of God. Obviously, we want to stay away from something like that. Um, so this is, and I'm not saying you were thinking that, Victoria, but I just wanted to make that clear. We'll ask Father Bonaventure what he thinks if he's able to join us. If you're just jumping in, we're still waiting for Father Bonaventure, who is still trying to join us. I would love to share this text thread with you, but I can't. So the poor Father Bonaventure is being thwarted by his computer. So Joseph has written in asking, "Good evening, fathers. You may have covered this in your introduction, but I was wondering if you think the issue with IVF can be explained through a perverted faculty argument, and if so, how would you formulate that?" That's an interesting question, Joseph. I suppose. What would I say about that? Um, I suppose so. I mean, again, the way that I've always done it though is to highlight either how many embryos are destroyed in the process. I think this is a very grave evil that resonates very deeply with a lot of people. The second and in some ways more fundamental reason IVF is wrong, though, is because it separates the generation of children from the procreative act. So that those two things have to be always united, and this is why any kind of sexual act that separates the generative aspect, for example, from sex is wrong. So that's really a key principle, and something that I'll probably just keep repeating as we continue our conversation here this evening. Our third question sent in from a our third question sent in from a Patreon supporter comes to us from Paolo. Paolo writes, "Hello, fathers. Off topic. Here goes. I learned how to debate relativist. Also, thanks to the Thomistic Institute lectures, particularly those by Professor Joshua Hochschild. Nice. Pointing out the reality of some moral absolutes. For example, torturing children is always wrong. Rape is always wrong. However, even that seems to be corroding. I saw a leaflet on campus saying rape is resistance in the name of justice. Holy Moses. Okay, Lord have mercy. Thoughts, comments. How could you reach people who no longer seem to believe that some acts are intrinsically evil and instead think that whatever the ideologically determined oppressed does to the ideologically determined oppressor is right, no matter how abominable that is? Thanks and God bless." Well, I think, Paulo, in your question, you certainly get to what's at play, right? What we're seeing around us is a kind of designated oppressed class. And as long as you fall within that oppressed class or have that kind of victim status, you can't do anything wrong ever. And this is why stealing and looting and rioting are now held to be right, as long as you're upholding the social justice cause of the moment. That's just one example that we're seeing all over our country all the time now. Uh, so I think there's certainly a very grave difficulty there, and we have to explain the from the Christian perspective what nonviolent resistance looks like. This is what's beautiful about the civil rights movement, as led by so many great Christian leaders in the United States. There's something deeply Christian about that, and I've thought about this a lot from the perspective of persecuted Christians, because there's all kinds of research about how those communities of persecuted Christians are able to forgive, even living amongst their persecutors. And there's something about Christianity that requires a generosity, a kind of sacrifice that is radically opposed to um, this bifurcated structure of oppressed and oppressor. because the response of the Christian when oppressed is always the gospel, and that has um, extraordinary calls to life and to action that are very difficult for people to imagine and to live, like like the kind of forgiveness that's just so radically different than seizing justice for oneself. So yes, I agree with you. This is a huge problem. We have to figure out ways to break that matrix of that simple class structure of I mean, it's really a Marxist thing, right? Between the oppressor and the oppressed. But to the first point, that is really a wretched thing. And in my mind, when you are talking about something as horrific as rape, or the murder of children, right? This is what we saw with the attacks on Israel, the murder of innocents, the raw murder of innocents that was just so horrific. When you're talking about something like that and someone can't see it, it's almost like the interlocutor denying the principle of non-contradiction in my mind. Like they're just some things that are so basic that every human person should be able to grasp. And if they can't or won't, it's because there's some kind of ideological commitment that's going to inhibit that conversation. So that is a really difficult thing. Yeah, if you can't get someone to assent to that, to assent to those to something so obviously evil like rape or the murder of children, to me that's like denying the principle of non-contradiction. And if someone does that, it's impossible to dialogue with them. Actually, it's just impossible to have a coherent and logical argument. Um, So the way to break through that is by a kind of witness of love that is so stupefying it brings people out of their dogmatic slumbers. Well, thanks again for those friends who have dropped in some Patreon questions, to you, Victoria, to you, Joseph, and to you, Paulo. Victoria, like I said, if Father Bonaventure is able to get the hamsters that run his computer going, um, then maybe maybe we'll get to that question. So, if you have other questions tonight, drop them in. We can continue the conversation on IVF. I can jump into other questions that maybe you have. Let's look at what Josie's asked. Josie says, "Hey, fathers, do you have any words of wisdom to help me make a good examination of conscience? Sometimes I cannot remember sins I have committed in the past few weeks, and sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions, so to speak. Y'all are the best." Oh, thanks, Josie. Really appreciate that. Of course, the kind of perennial advice from confessors is to go through the Ten Commandments. I actually think that's very difficult because some of the sins that we're more likely to commit have to be deduced or extrapolated from the commandments. So for me, I've always found it much better to use a more thorough examination of conscience, where those questions, those subparts of the Ten Commandments are pulled out. Um, for example, honor your father and mother. Okay, well, that by extension would apply to our commitments to our entire family. So our loyalty to the commandments has different aspects of our moral requirements in our life, and those good examinations of conscience that are written, that have lots of questions surrounding each particular commandment. Those are a lot more helpful. Another thing that I really appreciate doing is simply going over my last confession. I know for some people this might strike them as odd because, of course, what has been confessed in the confessional has been forgiven, and it's been completely obliterated by God, in the eyes of God, in the eyes of His mercy. But I just kind of check in and see where I'm at with tendencies to sin. We all have certain temptations that resonate more profoundly, certain temptations that exercise a greater hold on our minds and our hearts. And so for me, it's helpful to go back to that moment and to check in, as it were, with my last confession. I try and go every 2 weeks, so that's relatively easy for me. I think everyone who's serious about the spiritual life should be going to confession once a month. And when you hit that kind of regularity, it becomes easier. But To the latter part of your question where you're saying, Josie, sometimes it just feels like you're going through the motions. I mean, yeah, that's just it. You know, not every confession is Paul's conversion. Not every time we receive absolution are we experiencing such tremendous heights and grandeurs of God's goodness. And I think there are two reasons for that. I think the first reason is because the way the sacraments work in our life are the normative means of God's grace. So God wants them to be just kind of He's designed them to be regular for us. Thomas Aquinas, when he's talking about the institution of the sacraments, says that God gives us the sacraments in ways that we can actually receive the graces He intends to give us through them. Meaning they are by design kind of ordinary for us. Um, the second reason is because I think we're just not capable of experiencing that much goodness from God. It's got to be built up in us. If we really knew what God had planned for us, we would just die. We would be so overcome, we wouldn't be able to continue to live. So I think that God has to um, veil these things, as it were, from us and gradually reveal them to us. Which is why, again, some of the sacramental life seems kind of humdrum to us. But that's just our emotions. That's not the reality. The reality of the sacraments are that every time we're able to engage in them, there are such extraordinary graces on offer, all of which are beyond our deserving and extend far beyond what we can imagine in God's goodness. So that's important to remind ourselves of, because the heart needs to be led by the mind, and we have to lead the will with the intellect. Okay, so Reagan notes, one of my professors, who's also Dominican, has said he thinks apples are substances but not oranges. Any thoughts? That's hilarious, Reagan. I have no idea why he could hold this view. um, Apples are substances but not oranges, unless he's just being coy. If this is a serious view, I'm deeply confused by it. One trivia fact about Dominicans and oranges is that St. Dominic is said to have brought oranges from Spain and planted them in the cloister at Santa Sabina. And so there are orange trees that are regarded as having been planted by St. Dominic. I mean, they're certainly very ancient trees, which still bear fruit in the Dominicans' international headquarters at Santa Sabina in Rome. So there's a little Dominican orange trivia there. Again, guys, if you're just jumping on, I'm sorry that Father Bonaventure can't join us. It sounds like he's just not going to be able to make it. So I'm going to wrap up with our last two questions. So you just got Father Patrick tonight. I'm sorry. We're certainly much more fun when we have two of us, but we've been defeated by the failures of internet telephony. Okay, so here's a question from HG. Good evening, fathers. Related to IVF, how do we go about being charitable in these topics when the other party only seems to see embryos as products to be bought? This is a huge point. I'm really glad you brought this question up, because one of the issues from IVF, and this extends into surrogacy, is the commodification of children. And we're seeing this all over our culture today, right? This came up in the New York Times story last month about the moms who sell pictures of their daughters through these Instagram networks, which is pretty horrific. Again, Elizabeth Scalia wrote a great piece on this over at our Sunday Visitor. I'm just going through all my OSV content. This is what I do all day. So I'm just sharing with you what I've read. Elizabeth's piece is called "The Daughters of the King Are Not for Sale." And it's a really great piece. So we're seeing the commodification of children in a number of ways, right? Through surrogacy, through selling photos from these Instagram influencers, these mom-run accounts of these children. I mean, that is horrific. That's really nasty stuff. And then through the buying and selling of embryos. And I think that that's certainly one thing that we could lean into when we have these arguments. Part of the reason why the church is against IVF is because the church thinks it's wrong to buy and sell children. Because once we go down that road, things become very dark very quickly. I think we can probably win some ground in various arguments by explaining that point. Emily writes, she's got a quote from the Catechism here. Respect life and integrity of the embryo, directed towards its healing, the improvement of its health, or its individual survival. Embryos are not disposable biological material. Could not agree more. And I think that's right. So this is developing kind of the same theme that HG was on to, right? That when we treat the embryos as commodities, we end up destroying the humanity of truly children. So HG's last comments here. There was an op-ed some time ago written by a single mom who opted for IVF, specifically asked for a female embryo, but got a boy instead. She wanted to sue the clinic for not getting the right product. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and of course, as we continue to commodify our children, we're going to continue genetic editing. I mean, one of the things that becomes at risk here is the pre-selection of the embryo. So if you have multiple embryos that have been fertilized and implanted, these are multiple children, right? And then doctors will evaluate them and offer parents a selection of which ones get to live and which ones will be terminated. So these are really selective abortions. As these embryos are implanted, sometimes they'll keep them all. I mean, and it's just going to vary in place and by procedure. But the point here is that once we've decided children are a commodity, they become a commodity, as HG is pointing out, that we can assess. We can determine what is valuable to us. We could dispose of a child who has Down syndrome, for example, because that child hasn't lived up to the parent's expectation of who the child should be. So I think that's something that we ought to be very wary of. Pope Francis hammers this home all the time whenever he talks about surrogacy and IVF. Pope Francis hits this point, this argument about the risk of the commodification of children, and I think it's really the right one. It's really an important one. I think rhetorically people are sensitive to it because trafficking is wrong, slavery is wrong, selling children is wrong, and we're able to help move people a little bit more in that direction that way. Well, again, I'm sorry to be a little bit abbreviated here tonight. I'm missing my partner in crime, Father Bonaventure. Father Bonaventure would certainly be explaining, were he here, that that the ends don't justify the means, and that the integrity of the act matters from beginning to end. So even though you're pursuing a good end, that is the procreation and generation of children, by going about it through the wrong means, by in vitro fertilization, you've compromised the moral integrity of the act. So he would certainly go on at length about this. I just want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight, despite our difficulties. Please continue to follow our project. To all of you who like and subscribe to Godsplaining on all the social media platforms, we appreciate it. We're especially grateful to those of you who are Patreon supporters. If you haven't heard, we've got some great events coming up this spring and over the summer. You could follow those over at our website at godsplaining.org. You can also find there information on how to shop Godsplaining merch and other various news and information about the Friars. Just to give you a little tip on something that's coming. We're starting a monthly newsletter, which will be very exciting and will be filled with great material, especially if we can convince Father Bonaventure to write it. His newsletter announcing the Friday night movie, The House of Studies, was for a long time the best newsletter that I subscribe to. So keep your eyes peeled to pound that subscribe button for our monthly newsletter, which is coming. Otherwise, as we head into Holy Week, the holiest time of the year in the life of the church, please know that we're praying for you and we ask for your prayers for us. Thanks so much, friends. God bless you.